My name's Michael Doksti. I'm a staff writer at Forbes. It's good to be back here at Consensus with the amazing panelists over here to my left. We're talking about open by design, the theory and hopefully reality that a lot of the work that everyone in the audience and on the stage is doing can strengthen each other, work together, and maybe make the world a better place. I approached the panel with a little bit of a skeptical eye, and I hope that everyone in the audience approached it with a little bit of a skeptical eye as well. And I hope that we can kind of get through all of the reasons to perhaps be doubtful of the open design concept, and then look forward to the future of what it might enable. To get the ball rolling, though, I've asked Ms. Marie Wyack from IBM to get us started with unpacking the very lofty-sounding title of our conversation today. So, Marie, what is open by design?
Well, we've been a long-standing participant in the open community, and there's been a lot of discussion these days about open and open source, and we think it's more than that. Important to have an open, embracing community, and we think that comes not only from open standards, particularly in blockchain about open data models and how people are sharing data, open source, but not just taking your source code and putting it on a GitHub repo, but actually creating an open community that has an open licensing model, that you know where the provenance is of your software that you're now participating in, an open governance model. How do you know that your contributions will be accepted and how to participate? And that community. At the end of the day, the most important thing is adoption and usage and creating an embracive community to really drive innovation.
So just putting a bunch of code that you and your friends wrote on to GitHub doesn't necessarily qualify as open by design. Could you give one or two examples of either an industry or a product or a service that is today closed that perhaps at some point down in the future might be opened up? Where's the opportunity in that space?
Well, you know, certainly what we see here, even in blockchain, there are so many different participants in the ecosystem, and we started on Ethereum. We've obviously been very actively engaged with both Hyperledger and with Sovereign, among others. The real opportunity, I think, is in interoperability. At the end of the day, somebody using blockchain does not know or care what DLT is under the covers. What they care about is the ability to have a collaborative data sharing platform. And if they can do that and do that with ease, then it advances all of our solutions.
So I want to ask a question of the audience. I'd like to ask you to kind of think back to 2013, 2014, when you first started hearing the likes of Microsoft and IBM branding themselves as sort of open by design, contributing to the open source community. How many of you were skeptical the first time you heard that Microsoft and IBM were going to build software and give it away for free for everyone else to build on? Raise your hand. So there was actually, I'd say about half skeptical, and half kind of gave you some good support there from the beginning. I was fascinated to learn sort of as we were preparing for this conversation that there were some skeptics on the stage as well. And so I want to kind of bring that out and talk a little bit about the process, how we got here. And to do that, I'm going to put Marley on the spot here to get us started. So 20 years ago, you were still at Microsoft.
Yes.
And you had a rabble-rousing CEO named Mr. Steve Ballmer, who was fighting a cause. Could you tell us a little bit about the cause that Steve was fighting and how it stands either in harmony with what we see today or diametrically opposed?
Well, we look at the start of a journey. If you look at where we are today, and we won't get there yet, but where we started out when the whole open source movement got started, it was seen as evil. We fought it tooth and nail, and it was just something new, and nobody knew what the business model was going to be, and it was just the easy reaction, and you see this early on in these types of things, is to defend, and you do some weird stuff when you're doing that. Looking back on it, it seems quite silly.
What about it seemed evil back then?
Well, you didn't know what the business model was. I mean, everyone was like, we're making money, and this is our, at the time, you also remember where we were going through from a Department of Justice perspective. We were threatened to be broken up, and so we had all these.
Concrete example with was it the Linux? Or?
Well, yeah, I mean, if you think about sort of the Linux Foundation, Linux coming out, threatening the Windows franchise, and if we look at how the Linux Foundation got started and that whole open source community, I often think that Microsoft, in a way, the way we reacted actually helped it get its poop in the group, if you will. Because everyone came together. We were the big hairy giant going, this is evil, 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 and everyone grouped together, and the Linux movement just really accelerated. And look at where we are now. We're a huge Linux shop, and
what is the big picture lesson there that you started to learn about how closed source reactions against open source play out in the real world?
Well, I think some of the things when you do closed source is how do you get the standards took 5, 6, 7 years to get, because no one was working together from the start. And the way we learned in the open environment, and we look at things today, when we go out and we know we're going to start something and it's an initiative, we don't show up to the party with a complete solution. We show up with open sources. We don't show up with nothing either, because nothing will get done. You said this is a basic framework, about 50, 60%, and say, hey, help us contribute this. And this is how you start building momentum. We talked about this with Sovereign as well, is how do you start building this ecosystem where it's not just open source, it has momentum and people contributing, and that's the thing you have to strive
And I definitely want to get there. Before we do that, Heather has some amazing stuff she's going to offer in a moment here, but I want to skip you one more time and ask Marie to bring a skeleton out of the closet for us. We had a time to talk a little bit about IBM's history with mainframes. Could you talk to us a little bit about the battle in the early days to protect, and then how that has sort of evolved into you sitting on a panel today talking about open by design?
Well, clearly we have a long-standing and continuing franchise in the mainframe and in even operating system software. But we recognized way back in the early days of e-business about the power of embracing an open ecosystem. In fact, the first time that I worked with Microsoft was on web services and XML standards to help drive some of the interop of browser war vintage era. But on the mainframe in 2001, we made a pledge to the Linux Foundation in New York City at Linux World, $1 billion investment to shift our ecosystem investment on services, on operating systems, on products, all supporting Linux. And that foundation just has continued with all of the new projects, including the Linux Foundation Hyperledger. Now over 270 companies and 12 projects. And today, our blockchain platform is running on a mainframe, but on a Linux One mainframe on our cloud in an interoperable fashion. And we're supporting not just Linux on the mainframe, but Linux on x86, on AWS, on Azure, because we believe it's important to meet people wherever they are. It doesn't matter what technology choices you've made already. We want you to be able to participate in a network and get that community sharing model and get that embraced.
So both IBM and Microsoft had an opportunity to sort of learn from some more closed-off origins and have evolved and expanded. I think there's probably still skeptics out there. There's certainly the sort of public blockchain purists that think anything short of pure decentralization is heresy. But it's really helpful, and I think it's cool to kind of see that evolution. Heather, you kind of are in a different place. I'm sure the Sovereign Foundation has skeletons in the closet, but we're not going to ask you about those, so you can relax. Instead, I'd like to ask you just very briefly, refresh everyone's memory that doesn't know, what is the Sovereign Foundation? When were you founded? You're a new company, which I think is important. And since you were founded in the blockchain world, tell us a little bit about how you decided to go open.
Right. So the Sovereign Network, and this is an open source global public utility for identity, for digital identity. We were founded 2 years ago. Specifically, we were founded open source. It's also, we work off of Hyperledger Indy. So the origin of the Sovereign Foundation was exactly what you described. A group of individuals came together, developed code to create this open network. They knew that a group of people by themselves were not going to create the vision, so they decided to donate that code into an open source ecosystem for all. The Sovereign Foundation was established to help create that community, to help drive growth and adoption, and to help with the governance framework in which that overarches the entire network. And like you said in your earlier comment, when it comes to open source, defending and rejecting is easy. Participating in the community is hard because, as we all know, team projects, right? We start at a young age. Team projects are difficult and challenging, but at the end, the greatest rewards are often reaped when you work with a diverse group of individuals, and that's exactly what the Sovereign Foundation does for digital identity.
So I think key word at in your title, I think, is foundation.
Foundation.
That's something that's different than what IBM and Microsoft
We're
have.
a nonprofit.
So yeah, business structure, nonprofit organization.
Nonprofit.
Why was it important to you from a business perspective, and perhaps more importantly from an adoption and a momentum building perspective, that you establish as a nonprofit?
Because we're not here to compete against everyone. We're here to provide that underlying system, in this case for digital identity, in which other organizations can come and build upon to solve business problems that are specific to them. So they can focus on what they're good at, and then they have an underlying interoperable layer. So if they decide to move into other verticals or other solutions, they can do so, and they're not having to worry on focusing on something that everyone can contribute to for the greater good. For instance, when you decide to launch a website, you're not going to set up your own telco. You're going to sign up with an ISP that ultimately can give you the pipes for what you want to build. Sovereign Foundation is very much the same. So how do we function? We actually are supported by sponsorships and donations of our community who sees the value in what we offer to build this community together.
So when we talk about the idea of open by design, whereas IBM and Microsoft have kind of evolved that way, you were making those design decisions from day one.
Day one.
So now you all work together in varying capacities here. Very different origins brought you to this same place. And I'd like to kind of just take a moment and talk a little bit about what it is about blockchain that is allowing that to happen. And are we going to get past the perception, right or wrong, that this kumbaya moment is a little bit more marketing than reality? You guys are really working together. So talk about how you work together and how that is actually resulting in some changes to the way that business is done.
Yeah, I mean, I'll take a stab at it. So if we take a look at, talk about underlying foundations and having a sort of common substrate where we can all sort of differentiate on top of. So Microsoft and IBM have been partners for decades, and we've competed and have a storied history of conflict. And but if we look at where our business strengths are, we actually complement each other in this space quite nicely. Yeah. We at Microsoft we want to support all of the different blockchains that our customers want to have, but we also want to be able to support common identity because we don't want to have the problems that the enterprise suffered for 20 years. And so when we look at IBM and the work that they're doing, they're really focused on transforming companies, digital transformation. And that's a lot of consultative work, and they see blockchain as an enabler of that, and we see blockchain as an enabler of unlocking a broad platform within our cloud that lets those customers that IBM's working with tap into the things that we offer in our cloud. So it's a collaborative environment where there's enough elbow room for everyone. There's just a massive amount of opportunity that blockchain in itself, if you look at it in a overall systems design, and it's about 10%. It's a very small fraction, but it unlocks the value of all of the things that you can do on top of it, especially when you have interoperability across those ecosystems, and that's why we see that benefit with IBM.
So Marie, to build on that, as I recall the history here, we're talking about step one being helping write the code for Hyperledger Fabric. And then similarly to Hyperledger Indy, giving it to the Linux Foundation, and then starting to build some commercial products using that open source software. So far, so good?
So far, so good.
Okay, cool. So at what point in that process were you starting to think maybe Microsoft isn't just a competitor? Maybe Microsoft is somebody that can make us stronger at what we're doing. At what point did that realization hit you? Was it you and your team of coders and leaders writing that founding code for Hyperledger Fabric, thinking, man, this is going to be great to work with Microsoft, or did that happen slowly over time?
So, a lot of people think we are, totally religious on Fabric. We started on Ethereum. And we just didn't see the permissioning aspects that comes from sovereign and some of the other attributes that most enterprise customers want. And we continue to look at and participate in a lot of other DLTs because at the end of the day, it's about open innovation and addressing the problems people have so they can actually use blockchain networks on board, interoperate much more quickly. That culminated in developing some code that became a nugget to start Fabric. And that has grown, now version 1.4, which we have in our platform beta, which is running right now, which is an entire stack that is interoperable on a Kubernetes base. So again, very open source, very open stack grounded, which our premise is everybody needs to participate and get value from a consensus model and a participation in a network. That shouldn't matter if those customers have made a technology choice to run on Microsoft's cloud or someone else's cloud for that matter. It shouldn't matter what data standards they have used. How do we drive interoperability? It should be consistent that there's a common identity form, and that's why we're a sovereign steward and participating with sovereign, because if you've got permissioned blockchain networks, you clearly want to know who you're working with. And you want that same permissioning to be, whether it's one of the networks that we've helped customers on their digital journey get to, or one of the ones that might have been started with work with some of the other participants in the room here. If they can interoperate, if there is known identity, if there is permissioned access to their data, then there's a natural synergy. Rising tide raises all boats in this market. And therefore, we see a lot of the same challenges that Microsoft's been trying to tackle, we're trying to tackle, others in the industry. That is what, at the end of the day, I think is going to make the difference. When we talk to a farmer about proving the sustainability of their lettuce, they couldn't care what DLT they're on.
Yeah.
What they care about is getting business value. If we can deliver that to them faster and easier through open standards and through open innovation, then that's the path it's going to take.
So speaking of sort of common problems that you all have, I think it was really interesting to see Microsoft come out with that pretty big announcement that you were working with Quorum, the permissioned but open source blockchain that was built by JP Morgan et al. And is kind of, maybe someone might say, a competitor to the Hyperledger Fabrics of the world. But you also have a history with public blockchain use.
Right.
And we're one of the very earliest big companies to say scary words like Ethereum in public on stage before it was socially acceptable for companies to even talk about cryptocurrency. And Marie, your work with IBM sort of similarly has the permissioned blockchain using open source technology built on Hyperledger Fabric. And you just recently made, well, I guess it was 2017 now when you came out that you were working with Stellar.
Mm-hmm.
So there's this, in both these big companies, there's this balance that's being seem to be trying to strike between purely public blockchain use open source and permissioned blockchain open source. And I know, Heather, again, you're in the middle of the story here, but because your company's in a different position, you don't exactly have that same dichotomy. I'd like to just open it up to all three of you to just spend some time with us kind of talking about how you strike that balance, how you know how much privacy a client wants, how much publicity or public access a client wants, and from a business perspective, how do you figure out ways to, if not make money, at least pay the bills and stay afloat?
Right. So I think with the Sovereign Foundation, we're a public permission blockchain, so we bring both sides of this in. But it's really important with a foundation, we're that neutral, third-party, vendor-agnostic organization, and bring organizations like Marie's team, who are collaborating side by side with thousands of organizations around the world together. And these are small organizations that maybe have just started their company to the scale of IBM and Microsoft working together. So you've got this robust community that spans all verticals, all continents, all types of solutions working together to create a underlying infrastructure that they don't have to worry about, and they can focus on what they do best. And so when you talk about how do you bring everyone together, in the foundation's role, it's understanding and respecting each contribution. It's encouraging people to work with each other. A lot of times we'll see this concept of open source means I develop a solution behind closed doors, I don't communicate with anyone about it, and then I dump it on the community and call it a contribution. That is not in the spirit of open source. So that's what we work with organizations to understand. When you do that, it actually doesn't spur the growth and adoption you want. And this is just a common part about being human, is when you bring people along with you in your journey, when you allow for discussion and debate and points of view that you may not agree upon, what you're doing is bringing together a group of people with you. And so what we're seeing in the open source community, specifically at Sovereign, is let's have these conversations every step of the way. And so we're there trying to facilitate, especially larger organizations, to understand it's not about defending, it's about contributing and participating.
So I want to take just a half step backwards here. That was awesome, but I'm going to ask you to define a term. What is a public-private blockchain? And when you were getting your feet off the ground here and making these early design decisions, what was it about the decision to go with the sort of hybrid model that you thought was the right way forward to reach the boiling point that everyone in this room is hoping will happen?
Well, I think it goes to what Marie was saying, is when you have enterprise-specific solutions, having that ability to have permissions around context and how it's used is important. But in order to set up a global identity system and network like Sovereign does, is you need to make sure that no one entity controls it, no one government has access to change it, that it's truly global in nature. So that allows the public part of it. So the layer one of our network is what we call the public network. It's the ability to look up where you need to go for identity. It's the layer two that specifically, which is the permission piece that addresses what Marie was talking about. It gives enterprises and organizations the ability to have control for the context in which they're providing solutions.
Yeah, I think this is like one of the ways that you'll see, the public network adding value to enterprise and consortium networks. And from our evolution in this, we started on the public Ethereum. Actually, Bitcoin was before that. We actually did some work there. But
I would love to talk to you about someday.
So if we took that position on the public network, and there was just so much enthusiasm, and the innovation was happening very, very rapidly. But we do have our enterprise customers that were inspired, but wanted to have the privacy and the performance that they needed there, and that's how we formed like the EEA, which I sit on the board of, and we started to look more broadly of how do we recognize that customers are not going to find, especially the big ones, aren't going to be on one network.
Yeah.
You're going to have a foot in multiple networks. Some of them might be private, multiple privates, but the common public networks will provide utility like the ability to start to have interoperability. And as we start to look at these things and bringing the Ethereum community and the partnership that we have with JPMC and the Quorum and Azure Blockchain Service, and working with IBM with their strategy and making sure we look for ways where's that value that we can get to bring these together, and that's where we started the Token Taxonomy Initiative, which IBM was participating in, and really talking about what customers are trying to do is they're trying to be able to use and generate value on these blockchains and have them move across these networks and be interoperable with each other. How do you do that in a world that, where we have these silos and completely different blockchain systems underneath? You do that by working together early on and not building up fences in the beginning and saying, hey, let's get together and let's just agree on some things and let's start building from there and to try to figure out what is that substrate? And where should that substrate be? Should it be on a public network? Yeah. And if so, the announcement we had yesterday using the Bitcoin network for ION and the identity overlay network itself is another interesting example that we're seeing. So I think the two, in reality, will evolve, and most users will see this seamless the way most corporate users don't even know they're on the internet or not.
There's a lot of skepticism out there from the sort of public blockchain purists who think that the permissioned implementations are sort of simplifying the benefits, and they aren't quite as powerful as the public blockchain, but that the permissioned instances are sort of bridges or stepping stones towards true decentralization at some point 100 years from now, or 1,000 years from now, or 10 years from now. I don't know. What do you say to those people? Are they onto something there? That the permissioned implementations of these design systems, the permissioned design choices are sort of bridges and stepping stones towards an eventual world where public blockchains, through technology like zero knowledge snarks, give you the best of both worlds? Or are they maybe being a little bit romantic and unrealistic, and the public blockchain utopia that they're envisioning isn't really what's going to happen?
I think there's a strong place for both. I mean, we released some principles about what we've seen from now 1,300 different networks running on our platform. And permissioned blockchains for a fit-for-purpose, bring your ecosystem, scale the data you want to share, is perfect for use cases like trade, like provenance. But permission doesn't mean private. And anytime you want to exchange value across networks, where you're now not just talking to a food industry or a finance community or a healthcare community, but are actually taking tokens, which need a common definition regardless of what model, and identity, which need a common definition regardless of what DLT, now you can have exchange of value with access. So our use of Stellar, our use of Sovereign, are both examples of public networks for a specific purpose, to exchange information on identity, to exchange payment information, and both, I think, are really important, which is why, I would say to all the naysayers out there that are skeptical about the openness commitment, come join us, tell us, work with us, and make sure we're addressing the real problems. We were talking earlier on about the early days of the internet, and nobody thinks today about what browser you're using. And there was years of browser wars that were conquered by interoperability. So coming back
you hear that? If you think permission blockchains are a scam, don't come to me, come to them. Don't tweet at me, tweet at them. I do want to turn the corner because we have a really concrete example where we can kind of bring this all together, which is the Token Taxonomy Alliance. Initiative, sorry. Very quickly, open question, whoever wants to jump on this. What is it? Who was involved? And how does it demonstrate the open by design principles that we're talking about here?
Well, I'll jump in that real quickly. So the first is the initiative is open. It's inspired out of the Ethereum community, but really we said, you know what, it's hosted by the EA, but it's not the EA. It's a standalone initiative that has Microsoft, IBM, R3, digital asset is also there. And then really we're looking for everyone to come in. And we think the the primary thing is coming out of it is defining a framework called the Token Taxonomy Framework, which is essentially defining what the terms are. When we go to talk to regulators or customers that are looking at using blockchain, and we throw terms at them like tokens and fungible and non-fungible and burning and things like that, they just glaze over, right? If you go talk about ERC20s and things like that, it just doesn't work. So what we're doing is let's back it up a little bit. Let's start agreeing on what terms are, how we define them, and then decompose tokens, because they can be fairly complex. And you want to be able to describe the behavior in business terms so that anyone can understand tokens. So it's not a technical implementation. It's we say it's neutral. That's why we have all of the major players, and if you have a blockchain platform you want to participate, please join us. We're not trying to exclude anyone, but then really the contributors will be the customers. The end users are going to tell us, I want this token to do this, and model it after real-world use cases, and let them define it in a common way.
Very quickly, what were the biggest obstacles to getting this to happen? Where were the biggest points of resistance to getting these groups together to build this collaborative initiative?
Convincing people of what it was trying to do, and that we weren't redefining the work that they had already done in their platform, but rather saying we're stepping it up a bit, a higher level, so that you'll have a larger total addressable market to really unlock the power of what distributed ledgers can do for tokens. And that really is going to then unlock the next wave of innovation that will happen after that. But this is fundamental, and that's how we got everyone to agree. So yeah, this is actually going to help us, not only for customers, but we can charge the hill with regulators with a common set of common terms and definitions, and not have to spend half of our meeting time describing what this term means and what does it mean to be this.
Heather, pressure, a lot, all on your shoulders here right now. I'm giving you the closing words. Okay. And I'd like to ask, with companies like IBM and Microsoft in mind, and companies like some of the biggest financial institutions in the world who are in the audience today, what are words of advice that you would give as an open by design first company for striking that balance between keeping your business model solid, but still capitalizing on the best of being open?
I would say get involved. Don't go tweeting him if you don't like what open source communities are doing, like Sovereign. The best thing you can do is get involved. Join a Hyperledger Indie call. Join the Governance Framework Working Group. Become a part of the Sovereign Alliance. This is just for the Sovereign community. But any open source is get involved, and all you have to do is simply dial in and start listening, because if you don't like what we're doing or trying to understand what the implications are on your business, the best way to do that is taking a seat at the table and making contributions, whether that's opinions, thoughts, or code. All of those are important because it adds up ultimately to create a system that will improve, create more efficiencies, and grow your own business and offerings.
I think those are good last words. What do you guys think? Thank you.
Thank you.